This is now lecture 2 in our ongoing discussion of missions, both in its theology and in its practical application. And today's discussion is focused on culture, religion, and worldview. But just before we go to that, let's recognize some of the discussion we've already had. Last time we spent time discussing a definition of missions, and I defined it as just a working definition, transcending cultural, social, and geographic barriers so that the gospel can spread to new locations and social groups. We acknowledged in that discussion that this definition opens up the possibility of missions that it's not just crossing over passport barriers, but that it could also be social barriers. It could be within a single location, a single nation, that you're working to interact with people that you might not otherwise connect with. And then we place this into the context of a broader biblical theology of missions. We started out with a major overview: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. But we moved from that then to follow the flow of missions, or a theology of missions, across the Old Testament. A strong repeated theme we saw there is that God has always been concerned about the salvation of the world. It's not as though he was at one time preferring the Jews and later moved to the Gentiles. How then do we explain the reality that there is a major progression here? That the Old Testament does seem to focus on the Jewish people. And we acknowledged here two different ways, if we want to describe it that way, two different modes of missions. A kind of centripetal focus in the New Testament, people going outward, versus a centrifugal in the New Testament, centripetal in the Old Testament. Kind of a framework of people coming to the central place, coming to Jerusalem to hear the gospel. And that actually took us even further afield to recognize a bigger pattern that stretches across the entire Bible, highlighting the centrality of the cross. That actually our theology of mission would show us that Jesus Christ is the center of the story of Scripture, and actually the whole point, the entire focus of Scripture. We also recognized as we moved into the New Testament that there's a framework that moves from the Gospels and Acts, and that flow outward then shows us the spread of missions across the world based on Jesus' original commission: go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, and following from that, the spread of the gospel to all the nations. But as you and I then seek to spread the gospel to the nations, we're going to encounter differences. And that again then is our topic for today: culture, religion, and worldview. How do we work through those differences? How do we account for them? And then how do we even apply biblical ethics to cultures, religions, and worldviews that are profoundly different, perhaps, than the one that we grew up under, or in which we were originally enculturated? I'm going to start out with a basic definition of each of these three elements, and we'll move in backwards order here. I'll start off with religion and worldview. We'll put the most time into culture. And having established those definitions, where we're really going with this entire discussion is moving into how these three elements relate. How do culture, religion, and worldview connect to one another? How are they different? How are they distinct? How are they the same? But as I said, to even get there, we've got to begin with a definition of worldview. And so I'm just using this as my working definition for the purposes of our discussion. I'm going to give you several definitions of each. OED, Oxford English Dictionary, defines worldview as a set of fundamental beliefs, values, etc., determining or constituting a comprehensive outlook on the world. It's a perspective on life. And you can see here the German roots of this, which basically etymologically comes out as worldview. How do you view the world? But it started life as a term from German, and then eventually came across into English. Here's a more expansive description of worldview. This is taken from James Anderson's book on the topic. And Anderson comments here that worldview is an all-encompassing perspective on everything that exists and matters to us. Your worldview represents your most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe you inhabit. It reflects how you would answer all the big questions of human existence, the fundamental questions we ask about life, the universe, and everything. And so if I was going to build out some of those questions, just example questions that would come up along the topic of worldview. Metaphysics. If you recognize these, I'm working through the three primary branches of philosophy. Does God exist? Is there a supernatural realm? Where did the universe come from? Just kind of the stuff of existence itself. And I could build these questions out further. I have elsewhere documents I've accumulated with 30 and 40 questions that would just build out this in a much more extended way. But for conciseness, where did the universe come from? Why is there anything rather than nothing? Epistemology, are there ideas that are clearly true and untrue? Is there a way humans ought to think? And how would we know the difference between true and untrue? What are the basis for our judgments, kind of our criteria for deciding between these things? Ethics, are there universal moral standards? How do we ground those standards? What does it mean to live well? And these three are the branches of philosophy, but I could go from that just as a summary statement. Basically, what on earth is going on in this weird universe of ours? I mean, I'm here, I exist, I was born, I'm on the planet, but the universe is weird. And how do I just give even a basic accounting of what's going on with it? This strange, bizarre universe that I inhabit. We could keep on going with worldview questions. Lots of things we could discuss here. What is beauty? What is valuable? What does it mean to live a successful life? Even really interesting niche questions like how different is the human experience based on, for instance, our ethnicity, our culture, our background? How different does it feel to be a white male living in 2023 versus a peasant female living in Russia in the 16th century? Like, how much would my language, culture, background affect the way I think and feel about the world and even my experience of humanness? One writer on this topic, Leo Apostel, gives 6 elements that he thinks every worldview has to have: an explanation of the world, a futurology, meaning where does the world end? How does it conclude? Ethical questions, what should we do? Methodology or a theory of action, how do we attain our goals? An epistemology or a theory of knowledge, what is true and false? And finally, an teleology, which is an internal focus thing, self-referential. How does a worldview explain itself? Now, there are other ways to break this up, and I actually think that particular explanation leaves some major things out. For instance, where did the world come from? But in any case, the basic concept of a worldview is, how do I explain all of it? How do I explain existence itself? How do I view myself within that? How do I view my purpose? Who am I? What am I here for? What would it mean to live well or not to live well? Everything. And as a result of that, to summarize that out, worldview is definitely intellectually focused. That's one of the distinctions we'll make as we keep on going. But if you just hold on to that for now, worldview is intellectually focused, as opposed to what we'll move to next, religion. For my definition of religion, I'll just do the same thing again. And we can use here just the same sort of structure of definitions, using first from Oxford English Dictionary and then Corduan. Corduan wrote the Worldview Handbook, Neighboring Faiths. And on these definitions then, definition of religion, according to Oxford English Dictionary, it's belief in or acknowledgement of some superhuman power or powers, God or gods, which is typically manifested in obedience, reverence, and worship. You've got the elements then of the deity at the center, belief in the deity, and then a practice, how you respond to that deity. And the definition goes on, such a belief as part of a system defining a code of living. So we've got an ethic, a deity, behavior in worship, and an ethic, especially as a means of achieving spiritual or material improvement. I think a more descriptive definition I've taken from Cordovan. And Cordovan writes that a faith or a religion is a system of beliefs and practices that by means of its cultus, that means its worship, the practice of worship, directs a person towards transcendence and thus provides meaning and coherence to a person's life. Let me pause for a second. Let's work with that definition just a little bit and recognize some of the elements. First of all, that concept of a system is important. In other words, it's not just, let's say, what distinguishes a religion from a superstition. You have a certain feeling about something, or every time I wear this hat, my baseball team wins or something. That's not a religion because it's not yet defined into a system. It's when it becomes a system that we could call it a religion, and it's a system of two elements, beliefs and practices. Okay, both things that you think are true and things that you think you ought to do. There is also the worship element to this. And what Cordovan's working towards here is he's distinguishing religion from just a general worldview or any kind of view about what is true and what one ought to do. In other words, as we'll keep on building out as we work with this, let's recognize everybody has a worldview. Even if I believe that there is no God and I believe that there is no point, if I go straight to a full nihilism, doesn't matter, just try to end it as painlessly as you can. Even if I do something bizarre like that, I still have a worldview. Like, worldviews are inescapable. You have to have a worldview. But Cordovan's idea is that a religion is something distinct from just a philosophy. An atheist does not have a religion in this sense, because a religion would specifically work by means of its cultus. That's a technical word, but it's just saying by means of worship practices, things a person ought to do in worship. And that, of course, then implies something about the deity or at least some kind of religious practice. Okay, the key word in Cordovan's definition here, however, is the word transcendence. It's a system that directs a person towards transcendence. That, again, is the attempt to distinguish off religion from, let's say, atheism. And as a result of it, then, providing meaning and coherence to a person's life. A religion opts or attempts to try to point to something greater. Now, this definition is actually the conclusion of an entire chapter in Cordovan. And it's because it's actually a really hard question to define out a religion as distinct from a philosophy in general. For instance, Buddhism is basically a kind of an atheism. But Buddhism doesn't posit a personal God. There's not a God that you relate to. There's not a God who knows you, thinks of you, acknowledges you, relates to you in any way. God in this sense is, you can think of it like a force, but it's just everything. It's the world spirit. It's sort of an existence itself. There's not a God then that you directly relate to. And so how to distinguish off Buddhism from atheism? I think most people would recognize Buddhism as a religion. Atheism is not. That's some of what Cordovan is working through. See, but even that difficulty, I think, brings us back to a point I would like to make here in connecting both worldview and religion together. Let's recognize that, in a very real sense, all of humanity is deeply religious. Religion is then not just a thing one sort of opts to do. Like I'll choose to be religious. A very common thing I hear when I talk to people in my context. I'm not a very religious person. All of humanity is religious in the sense that we worship something. And we might worship success or money or achievement status. We might worship pleasure. I mean, we might worship any manner of things, but all of humanity is by their nature, humanity, the worshiper. We all worship. And that connects back to worldview. Remember I said earlier that all of us have a worldview. You can't not have one. Even if your worldview is something really, really empty, like there's no point, we can't figure it out, there's no understanding, we're all living in some kind of hazy fog of confusion. I mean, even if you go with that, you still have a view on things. Humanity can't not have a worldview. We all do. And I make that point now to move to the what's going to occupy us really for the rest of this lecture. And that's the question of what is culture? Because in the same pattern, just as you can't not have a religion in some sense, and just as you can't not have a worldview in some sense, what I want to argue here is that culture is maybe the most deeply rooted and most inescapable of them all. You can't not have a culture. Everybody has a culture. So to do that, let's continue the discussion we've already used. Let's build out a definition of culture, and then let's work further to try to understand what it means and how it works. Again, I'm going to give you a couple of definitions first from the linguistic standpoint, starting with OED. OED defines it as the distinctive ideas, customs, social behavior, products, or way of life of a particular nation, society, people, or period. Helpful here to recognize just the sheer breadth of what constitutes culture. Ideas, customs, social behavior, products, way of life. So it's any of those things, really better said, all of those things. And those things in distinction or in connection to, now, different groups of people. What I'm going to refer to for the rest of this lecture as affiliate groups. Groups of people that you would look at and identify as, that's me, or that's someone I acknowledge, I understand as being my people. And that can be done across as a nation, society, people, or period. That can be defined even if you keep on working with it, like a family has a culture, a church has a culture, any kind of social pairing group, any kind of socially defined group that you can recognize as an affiliate group. That this number of people, whether 5 or 5 million or 50 million, this group of people in some way acknowledges, hey, we are us. There are some people that are not us, and then there are people that are us. Within the us, there's going to be a culture, because human beings always do this. Keep on going. For not just the lexical definition, but now more of a description of descriptive definition. And we have this. It's a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and their attitudes toward life. I'm taking that from Clifford Geertz, and he's writing as more like a cultural anthropologist on this topic. Now, this is a bit of nerdy language. It's a bit of technical language. When you get the language of symbolic forms, what he's just saying is that through various means, not just writing or art or something like that, but through all of our interaction, we have different ways of communicating with each other. And what he's done here then is kind of a communication model of culture, symbolic forms by which we communicate, perpetuate, and develop our knowledge about and our attitude towards life, how we relate to one another. A comment about that in just a little bit. We'll continue with some of those ideas. A third definition, and this is from Konrad Kotak, and he comments that it's the complex system of meanings and behaviors that defines the way of life for a group or a society. Each one of these you can see have kind of the idea of an affiliate group, a society, a nation, a people, or Clifford Geertz just says men. So some kind of affiliate group. And then within that affiliate group, a system. All of them have used the idea of system or distinctive, like the way that things are integrated together. Meanings. And so that's this communication sort of idea. Okay, so elements of that, an affiliate group, ways that we relate to one another, and then defined forms. Sometimes we say artifacts, text, literature, music, behaviors, social patterns, different ways that we expect one another to interact. And just to then fill that out, I guess I would define out culture as simply the game, or the rules of the game in which we play out our social interaction. Culture is fundamentally and deeply social. So if I go back through my other elements before, remember I talked about worldview. The word I would attach to worldview is fundamentally intellectual. How do I understand the world? How do I think about the world? Religion is fundamentally transcendent. That's the word I'd like you to put there. It's transcendent because it calls us to something beyond what we can see, experience, feel, touch, taste, and smell. And the word I'd like you to attach to culture is that culture is social. Culture is entirely lived out in relationship to the people around me. So if I ask kind of a worldview question like this, who am I? And I think of it as just defined in the isolate. Like, who am I all by myself? I think the answer of culture is you actually can't define yourself in the isolate. It doesn't work to define yourself in the isolate. This is a very Western way, I think, of thinking about it. Kind of okay, I just exist on an island, so I'm going to define me, and then I'll move outward from me to others. And I think a more realistic understanding of the world recognizes it's not really a who am I, it's a who are we. It's all of humanity, all of my affiliate group and my relationship to my affiliate group. That's now culture. And within then the discussion of culture, we can have a much richer understanding of ourselves. Who am I? No better. Who are we? Another point that I'd like to make, integrating culture with our other discussions of worldview and religion. Remember, with both, I argued that you can't not have a religion. You can't not have a worldview. Everyone does. Everyone has both. Okay, same with culture. And something I'd like you to have in your mind about culture is that culture is simply what we view as normal. In other words, when you live in the world and you go about and you do your thing, existence, work, sleeping, playing, relaxing, and everything else, you may not think of yourself as doing cultural practices. Or you may think of culture as like something separate from me. Like sometimes I go down and I go to a concert and there I experience culture. And I think that's wrong. Culture is the water in which we swim. Culture is all around us. It completely surrounds us in a way that's inescapable. Culture is completely, we're immersed in it. And so the idea of anyone saying, well, I'll just step away, I'll just reject, I'll repudiate my culture, I don't need my culture, I want to do it another way, is absurdity. Because even the attitude or the heart, the mindset that would lead them to reject the culture or pretend anyway that they rejected the culture is in fact something that the culture taught them to do. They think that way because the culture taught them to think that they're independent, and that's a good thing. It's also important to me to recognize that culture has a critical function. So again, related to what I just said, we might tend to say that I'm going to step away from culture, I'm going to pretend that I'm not part of it, or even repudiate it. That would be a bad thing. You need culture. And I think I can illustrate some of the complexity and how the way that we sometimes think about this with two questions, or two opposite kinds of ways that we talk about culture. On the one hand, we might say something like, that guy has culture. That man is a cultured man. Or, you say, I'm going to go to a concert. I'm going to get a little culture. I'm going to go to a cultural center. We have places that we call cultural centers, which is a little absurd. What we actually mean by that is centers for high culture. We mean a certain division within our understanding of culture, high and low culture. But cultural centers and that kind of thing. Okay, what have we just done? We've talked about culture, I think, in a reasonably positive way. That man has culture would be a compliment. I enjoy high culture, or I go to the cultural center, or I enjoy participating in a little culture. Is all of this is assumption that it's a good thing that all of us need? Okay, flip it around. Have you ever heard, particularly within Christian discussions, how has the culture affected you? Or are you being influenced by the culture? And what we've just done there is that we've used a negative assumption about culture. To be affected by the culture is a negative thing in our minds. And I'd like to piece that out a little bit with this argument that I'm making, that culture is unavoidable, it's necessary, and it's good. Culture is necessary and it's good, even as we'll see later that there are some concerns for how we as Christians relate to culture. But let's just think of it in these terms. Culture saves us time. As the accumulated knowledge of an affiliate group, a group of people, the whole process of information or traditions or thoughts or ideas being passed down from generation to generation, most of child rearing is enculturation. It's parents saying, well, here's the way that I came to think, feel, and act. And so I want to help you think, feel, and act that way. See, and the reason then that a little child does all kinds of inappropriate things, the child might throw food on the table. A child might climb under the table, pick up food, put it in their mouth. The child might not know how to greet someone in a polite way. The reason all of those things are going on, the child hasn't yet had time to learn culture. And what the parents are doing when they say, okay, look at the other person, put your right hand out, not your left hand, shake their hand. Or in a Philippines context, go take the hand of the older person, hold it to your forehead, bless. Okay, or in an Indian context, namaste. Okay, some of the things that people do, these are cultural expressions. And you've got to teach a child to be aware of them, to be polite. Culture saves us time and energy because we can't all learn all this new stuff again. And so our parents teach us, and therefore we hold on to that knowledge. In a very real sense, education is a massive endeavor for enculturation because you're trying to take information from a previous generation, insights that have been gleaned across years, accumulated in books and other resources, and hand that off to someone. And we all need it. Culture also coordinates our interaction. It's not just handing information across the generational divide, but it's also now the recognition that in a large affiliate group, we need some way to have settled categories so that we're not all confused about what to do. So an expression of this, I can't get up every morning and decide whether it'll be more fun today to drive on the right side of the street or the left side of the street. In my context right now, I'm in Canada. We drive on the right side of the street. There are places in the world where they drive on the left side of the street. What difference does it make? Very little. We just need to pick one. But we all need to pick the same one. It won't work for half of the population to drive on the right and the other half to drive on the left. We're going to need to pick one. We're going to need to have some kind of flow. We're going to need to have some kind of expectations, let's say a routine, a restaurant routine. When you go to a restaurant, the process of how you enter the room, how you navigate your way to a table, how you choose your food, how you communicate that, how you do any other communication about specific needs, when you pay, where you pay, how you pay. All of this is culture, but we just need a way to kind of know what to do. And we all need to be thinking the same thing. Like we can't come into every restaurant and first read a rule book about how the restaurant works and then, okay. We need just to kind of a consistent pattern. And you can recognize beautifully, interestingly, that in every culture, there are a couple of different restaurant routines. By the time you reach adulthood, you've learned the different routines. And so you walk into a restaurant and you actually realize, okay, this is the genre we're doing in here. This is a fast food one. Okay, let's do the fast food method. And in other restaurants, you realize, oh, this is a sit-down ordering restaurant. Okay, some of them will have you pay right at the table. Some of you have you go to the counter and you pay at the counter. You navigate all of those things, and you just know what to do because of culture. And here, I want to move outwards into a little bit of talk about the underlying complexity of culture, starting with the range of cultural diversity. I first would point out that culture is broad and relevant to every aspect of life. I've already said this, that as you go about in the world, you interact with culture all around you. It's the water in which we swim. It's inescapable. Okay, but just think about different ways that this is expressed. An example, table layout. I grew up in a Western context. It was typical that every place setting or every individual had their own plate. They had their own place setting. And basically the table or the plate is your domain. So if I dip food out of a bowl in the center, or whether it's a lot of times, probably just as often, we step over somewhere and we dish out especially in a social gathering, a separate table, then you bring your plate back. Okay, once you sit down with your plate, that's your plate. And nobody messes with your plate, right? I mean, it would be considered a pretty big intrusion if in the middle of a meal, someone looks across and says, grapes. I didn't see grapes. I'd like a grape. And they reach over, pick up a grape off your plate and eat it. Look over and they see a piece of bread they think looks good, and they take your bread and eat it and put their bread on your plate instead. Complete intrusion. Not acceptable. Okay, but I've been in other contexts, particularly in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, China. And in some of these contexts, you have a central bowl or a set of entrees. You might have your own plate. Usually you do. But it's a little bit more free in how these things flow around. So when I was in Singapore, I never put anything on my own plate. Like almost never. Because my friends would say, oh, you got to try some of this. They'd pick something up, put it on my plate, and take some of this too. And my plate would get loaded up, and I just sat back and relaxed. And they fill my plate, and I eat it. And when I got done, they'd put something else on my plate and fill my plate again. There are other contexts I've been in where we actually will set the food out in a kind of a general area. It's like on a long table. In the Philippines, banana leaves, and then you put the rice and the meat and things on top of it. And everybody just gathers around both sides of the table, and we just eat straight from what's in front of us. Just directly pick it up. Okay, those are all expressions of culture. And as I'll argue in a little bit, I think probably some of what's going on here is linked further back to deeper values. I think in a Western context, our individualist way of thinking about the world is reflected even in my plate, my space, don't mess with my plate. In a more collective, shared kind of context in the Philippines, we're eating together off the same space is expressive of our sharing together. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit further, a little faster down about 6 or 8 different topics. Here are other expressions of culture. Proxemics. The idea of proxemics is if this is me standing here, how closely do you stand to me? First time I arrived in the Philippines, we were boarding a bus, and the conductor said, come on in. So we came in, looked up there, and my wife turned around. She thought there's no more space on the bus. The bus is full. The man says, come on, there's plenty of space on here. Okay, assumptions about how many people you can pack in the bus and how much space is left over. How closely you would stand in a train in the Philippines. I have a person here. I mean, directly there is no room for movement. You don't need to hold on to anything because all the bodies around you hold you in. You just ride. Everything just holds in there together. Okay, how close is appropriate? And even down to things like personal space when you're talking. Okay, individual one, individual two. You sometimes in cross-cultural situations will watch a person from a closer culture come up, and the person from the more distant culture steps back because it doesn't feel right. And you get this kind of chasing thing going. Okay, it's a question of how close do I stand to you when I talk? That's a cultural category. Another thing that works like this is time. So sometimes in cross-cultural discussions, people point out that there are concentric, or there are levels of time that it's appropriate to space things out. So let's say that the meeting time is supposed to be at 7 o'clock. And we've both planned on this arrival time. Well, how much time is there that it would be considered still a sufficiently or acceptably late period of time? And we might represent that with a circle further out. And let's say that within about, let's say 3 to 5 minutes afterwards, you don't need to make an apology. That's just normal. Okay, but if I get further out from that, let's say I don't know, we're going to go maybe 10 to 15 minutes after the meeting time. So now we're at 7:10 to 7:15. Okay, at that point, you can do it, but you really deserve an apology. Like, you need to make an apology. You don't just walk in like, oh, how are you, and just pick up. You need to tell them why you were late at that point. Okay, now we have a further, what I'll call unacceptable zone. And that would be if I get out into the 30 to 30 minutes beyond. I mean, this is just anything past really 15 is just unacceptably late. And the interesting thing about this is as you go through different cultures, other cultures have different ranges for this. So just to go back through it, the kind of the late that is not a big deal, people don't even notice, it doesn't even come up. In some cultures, that might be up to 30 minutes, 45 minutes. In other words, you show up 30 to 45 minutes late, and it doesn't even need to be commented on. It's just normal. It's just what you do. The range that probably deserves an apology may be 1 to 2 hours. At that point, you need to say something. And then as far as the range that's unacceptable, for some places, that's going to be 4 hours plus, or maybe if you don't show up at all. But it's going to have to get way out there before somebody's just straight up mad at you for not showing up. Okay, that's culture, but it's expressed in terms of time. Other things that work like this, gender roles, family roles, multi-generational households, status. What makes a person a high status person? Is it education? Is it wealth? Is it connections? Is it age? Okay, different cultures do it different ways. Life scripts. So an assumption that when you get about to 14 or 15, what should you be thinking about? When you get up to 18 and 19, then what should you do? The typical 25-year-old has already... Those scripts are cultural scripts, and each culture has a script. Sometimes we resent the existence of the script, especially if our case doesn't follow exactly the script. But every culture has one. They all do it in some form or another. Conflict mediation. What do you do when two people are having trouble getting along? How do you navigate that? Should you go ask someone else to come into the situation? Do I kind of make a little hint and tell kind of, just a little implication, and then they pick up on that minor hint? Or do I use a bridge person who will go to them on my behalf? Or do I just go in and throw it all out there? Which would be probably a more American method, just say it all. Okay, these are cultural methods, cultural grids. How about an invisible map of taboo topics? There are certain things that you're allowed to talk about in different cultures. So if, for instance, I walked up to someone and I said, "You've gained weight. You're definitely fatter than you were last time I saw you." That comes off very rude in our context. What you have to recognize is that it doesn't come across rude in every other context. That is an appropriate thing to say. And I've absolutely lived in contexts where that's a fully appropriate, acceptable thing to comment on. Or contexts where someone might say, "Oh, you have a really big blemish on your face today. That's big." Okay, and that's just an okay thing that you might comment. Or how much money did you pay for your car? Or how much money do you make at your job? All right. Again, super not okay in probably most American contexts, but it can be appropriate. And I've been asked that in other contexts. So here's something that I think is worth knowing about culture in your interaction. Every culture has a map for those things. There's a map of the things you're allowed to say and the things you should not say. And different cultures have different maps, meaning when two cultures interact, they often tend to view each other as rude. So here, Juan comes up to Bob and they start talking. Well, Juan is he's very carefully avoiding all of the inappropriate topics on his map. But he's asking questions about the things that are perfectly okay to ask on his map. Bob, meanwhile, is carefully avoiding all of the awkward topics on his map. He knows what his taboos are. Juan knows what his taboos are. When they interact, though, they're both talking about things that are taboos on the other person's map, while carefully avoiding the things that are taboos on their map. And Juan and Bob both go home, and they comment to their wives, "Man, that guy is rude. You wouldn't believe the things he said to me. Super obnoxious." And it's just because in two different cultures, we each have our map. We're carefully following our own map, not his map. Or a final example of these types of things. How about privacy? What it means to be lonely, or what it means to share life. So in some cases, generally, probably because of the individualism thing, Americans tend to be a fairly private culture in some ways. We kind of want to go away to our place, shut the door, at least the physical space. You shut the door, that's your place. I've had people walk into my house without knocking, and it's just a difference of culture. People that come in, sit down in the room, and stay for the afternoon, it's just a matter of culture. But see, some of those things don't work for us in our system. And so you've got to recognize the difference and recognize the person's not being rude. If you're walking in a part of town that you didn't know in a foreign context, and you got lost, can you just go to someone's door and knock and ask for directions? See, that probably is acceptable in a lot of other contexts, maybe less acceptable in an American context. Why? Kind of we stick to ourselves. Or another example that sticks in my mind here, there was one point in the Philippines when I was sick. And so I was supposed to teach a Greek class that day. I messaged the guys. I said, I can't teach Greek class today. Not feeling well, have to cancel class. So they did the very reasonable, natural, logical thing to do. They all came to my house. And the reason they came to my house was to express concern. I mean, it was the reason for it was exactly because he's sick. And we wouldn't want, like, if you're sick and feeling miserable, you wouldn't want to be lonely. You'd want to have somebody with you. So you ought to have someone there. And so let's go to his house. We'll take him a meal. Yeah, they brought me French fries and a burger and came over, sat down at the end of the bed and just talked. Okay, now, in my system, that seemed like the most bizarre thing to do when a person is sick. In their system, it just expressed concern. And it was the right thing to do for them. Okay, these differences, you have to recognize as different systems. And you just work within those systems. You look and you recognize, okay, these guys are expressing concern. They're trying to be nice. They're trying to help in a situation because I'm sick. And I hope some of this has helped expose what I want to talk about next. And it's that culture is not only broad, but that culture is also deep. Culture goes to the core of who we are, and it affects every part of our existence. Okay, I've just talked about a variety of social type things, logistical things. Here's how this works. Here's how this happens. Here's how it goes. But I want to recognize that the reason we do these behaviors is not just the behaviors themselves, but there are deeper values that are expressed in them. That's critical. In other words, one of the bad mistakes we make about culture is that we assume culture is just a set of practices. Okay, we eat with forks, they eat with chopsticks. I eat off of our individual plates. They eat out of a common bowl. Okay, we wear suits. They wear barongs. And we just recognize categories on the surface level of what we wear, what we eat, maybe our language, and a couple of things about how we act. That is part of culture, but it's a very small part of culture. And here we ought to recognize then that culture involves a layering of things. First off are what I just mentioned, behaviors. Actions, what people do. Okay, that's the easy stuff. And I can include in this things like clothes, food, how you shake hands, how you greet someone, the language you use. See, but behavior, or the visible, belies, it hides a whole other set of things. How about values? And these are attitudes. What's good? What's desirable? What's best? I mean, if you think of everybody coming into a concert or a sporting event, and they want to pay top dollar for the front seat. What we've just said is that the place to be is in the front. So everybody's crowding in for the front. See, but I can think of other contexts, like maybe churches, where people are all competing for the back row. Why are they competing for the back row? I don't know. But it's an assumption about what is the good spot. If you had siblings growing up as a child, whatever was the thing everybody tried to get. They all wanted to ride shotgun, or they all wanted to be the first one to, I don't know, pick up their food, to get their food at supper, or they all wanted to be the first one to put their dishes in the sink because whoever put them in last had to wash the dishes. I don't know. You have these different things that the kids, the family created. That's the thing you want, and you compete for that. Everybody wants the red cup. Okay, what is good, what is desirable, what is best? See, but it's deeper than just the red cup now. It's down to stuff like, is it more important to be wealthy or to have lots of friends? Is it more important to be influential in the community or to have your privacy and be able to take nice vacations where you get away from the community? Right? I mean, there's assumptions here about what you want or what is good about life. How about a third, deeper level, beliefs? And here I move to knowledge, what is true or possible. It's in the intellectual sphere. See, but you can recognize here that it's gone down to how I view the world. Like, this is a worldview category. How I think about the world, what I think is true, how I think the world works. And the deepest category of all would be assumptions. And under assumptions, we can recognize these as preconceptions. What is obvious or needs no explanation. It's things that we believe are true, but we've never even stopped to think about why we believe they're true. Let me explain that last one just a bit. One of my favorite definitions for culture gets at this last thing, assumptions. And it's the idea of, or the definition of culture as the things that you point to in people's community or their behavior. And you say, why do you do it that way? Why do you act that way? Or why do you prefer this? Why is this considered a good thing? Why do people want this? You point at a certain thing and you ask, why is it that way? And they look back at you kind of blankly like, what? Like, isn't that just obvious? And if I was going to do an example, I'll do American culture. An example would be something like, why is independence and freedom a big deal? Why is it really important that you not be, or that you not need to rely on anyone else, but that you just take care of yourself and you do it without any help, standing all alone? Why this huge emphasis and discussion of liberty, freedom? Why is that such a big deal for you? Say that to an American, and they're going to look back at you like, how is that even a question? Like, obviously, I should be able to be myself. Obviously, I should be able to do whatever I need to do. Obviously, I should have the freedom to just express myself freely without limitations. Okay, that's a cultural value. And it's a learned value. It's not the only way to do it, even though, as a fellow American, if you are that, it might sound super obvious. It's not. It's a cultural value. And it's something that you learned and you received. Okay, those things that feel normal and obvious, like they don't even need a discussion, that's the core of culture. And if you think a little bit further about this diagram, I'd like to make two other points about it. One is to recognize that where we might focus on the purple behaviors at the top and speak of that as culture, that's just the tip of the iceberg. But there's a whole massive body of culture underneath. The very tip, that's only the narrowest stuff. If you really want to get into culture, it's the stuff you don't see. And therefore, as you and I are seeking to transform worldview, we might come in and try to convince someone to change their behavior. Hey, don't do that anymore. That's bad. And miss the fact that to really change worldview, I've got to not just change what they do, but their values, their beliefs, and their assumptions, everything underneath. And the second thing I'd like to make is related. The hardest thing to change in a worldview is the assumptions, because nobody's ever thought about how that works. Nobody's ever realized that they even have those assumptions. They just think of it as simply existing. And what makes that so hard then is that because we're not conscious of the rules by which we play, if we're monocultural, we view those rules, those assumptions, as the only sensible way to work. We think it's the only way to do it. Now we're pretty unwilling to change them because they're just assumptions. Everybody does this. Now, I could go on with discussions of culture or even examples of how culture works. There have been some attempts or some efforts at representing this. Various graphs that you can look at, some of them online, that would talk about the different cultural values. And I think this is a pretty good one to recognize cultural values kind of in tension against each other. So often it'll be a spectrum, and humans exist across that spectrum all the way. Clearest, easiest example to give quickly would be individualism, all the way across to collectivism. Do I view myself in terms of me, I stand alone, or do I view myself in terms of the community, the people around me? Okay, cultures and humans exist all across that spectrum at different points. Or other attempts tried to put this into just a few different cultural values and map out the world in terms of those cultural values. Probably a more helpful presentation for this, I think, is this grid. You're using three different kind of conglomerate ideas, and you're recognizing then that cultures or nations, that's one of the easiest ways to do this, exist between those grids. And so you can place your country with along the grid between one or the other. Just to explain out the Lewis model a little bit more, these are the 3 points of the triangle and what each one of those points represents. Okay, which of these do I think is the best model? I don't. I think these are all attempts at trying to put an organizational grid about on top of something that's really big. And it's nearly impossible to reduce down to just a couple of values. And yet it's helpful to take the time and the kind of effort to work through those values and recognize some of those differences. I want to return now to doing a bit more of an analysis of culture, worldview, and religion. And this is going to take us out to a conclusion for how we think about culture, how we think about all of these, and even how we ought to live our lives. So let's recover again our definitions of the 3. I define culture primarily in social terms. It's lived out in community. And so how do I relate to the people around me? I defined in relation to worldview and religion, first of all, worldview as kind of the intellectual side, a mental map for understanding yourself, life, and reality. Remember, I for culture, I focused on social or community. For worldview, I focused on intellect or thinking, how you think about the world. And finally, for religion, our key word there was transcendence. And I'm basically summarizing out Cordoban's definition here, but a system of transcendent beliefs and practices for life. Okay, how do those three relate? I've got three circles. Can I put those three circles in relationship to each other? What I'd like to recognize is, as we've already argued, these are deeply overlapping. So my culture, my worldview, and my religion are just like this. It helps us to recognize that in a secular or multicultural context, a US or Canada or even a Europe, we tend to separate these out. So in our contexts, in those places I just said, we tend to think of religion as sort of a separate thing over here. Culture and worldview are your other thing. And so religion is just something you do on Sunday. It's a very secular view of life. And I think that, in fact, probably represents many people. So their religion is just sort of, yeah, I'm Catholic. But in fact, what actually governs their culture and their worldview probably got defined less by the Bible or the Pope. It probably got defined by movies. It probably got defined by the people they talk to, or music, other influences. And so culture and worldview in this case are actually defining who they are and how they act. Religion is just sort of an adjunct. In this case, then, culture and worldview heavily overlapping. In other cases, I would say, let's say, a Hindu context. And in a lot of Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist contexts, religion and culture are indistinguishable in the sense that to be Polish is to be Catholic. To be Irish, well, used to be Catholic. To be Filipino is to be Catholic. I mean, those things are assumed to be pretty much overlapping. You can't be Arab and not be Muslim. And I think that's really important for our missiology, because when we're asking somebody to turn from Islam, we're asking them to turn away from their entire culture. We're asking them to basically, in their minds, act like Westerners. Abandon the culture of their upbringing, of their parents, of their people, basically repudiate their people, their affiliate group, and instead accept my people group. That's what's in their heads. I don't think it's true, but that's what's going on. And certainly Hinduism has increasingly just been indistinguishable in many minds from being Indian. Being Indian is to be Hindu. So to turn away from Hinduism would be to reject being Indian. But this kind of grid also applies to what I've described here already. If I'm talking about the nominal believer. The nominal believer in many contexts has separated out culture and worldview from their religion. How should believers think about it? And I think this is my best shot at representing what I would like to do personally for culture, worldview, and religion. I think I need to think of worldview and religion as the same or defined together, because I think Scripture needs to define the way I think about the world. I want the Bible to be my guide in how I think about it. Culture is going to be close. I don't want to be weird, so I'm not going to go out and wear, I don't know, a Roman toga. Right? I'm going to wear clothes that fit my context. And I'm not going to go about trying to use expressions that were in vogue 300 years ago. I'm going to try to use language, ways of acting that fit here. I'm not going to do the Filipino blessing thing on the streets of Edmonton, unless I meet a Filipino, right? Because I want to fit my context. So I want culture to overlap in a lot of ways. But in truth, I don't want to just wholesale accept culture. That's because of the next idea I would like to make as a major point, and that is that culture is a mixed reality of good and evil. Remember my idea earlier? I said that you have to have culture. Otherwise, you're going to make a mess of everything. Okay, so I can't just decide every day whether to drive on the right side of the street or the left side of the street. Why? Culture. I need culture to guide me. Okay, now if I take that across, I recognize that's a good thing. But on the other hand, I need to recognize that culture sometimes is quite a bad thing, because culture ends up getting into my head and affecting my values. I think this is a given if you just process that culture expresses as humans the stuff we love. Remember my diagram, assumptions and values and beliefs. Okay, if humans believe things about the world, if they feel things about the world, if they assume things about the world, and if they're fallen and sin has corrupted their thinking and their feeling and their responses, it only makes sense now that culture is sodden through with that brokenness. And so we have to talk about or recognize that culture is full of evil because humans have embedded their fallen, broken values into it. In fact, this mixed reality of good and evil, I mean, I've argued that culture is a good. I've also recognized that culture corrupts. That fits what we know about our theology in general. God made us good. Sin corrupted us. Okay, culture as an expression of the image of God is a wonderful and beautiful thing, except when it's not. And I have biblical support for some of this. I think the theology of 1 Peter is profoundly helpful here. Peter speaks to them as people spread across the ancient world as strangers who are exiled. Or a bit later, 1 Peter 1:17, past the time of your sojourning here in fear. This is the word exile. Or a bit later, we are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, a people that stand apart, so that we would call forth the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And so he urges us as strangers and pilgrims to abstain from fleshly lusts. Okay, this language, strangers and pilgrims, this language of sojourning, this language here of strangers, all of that is the word or the concept of an expat. I live in Canada, but I don't have a Canadian passport. I'm a guest. I lived in the Philippines for 8 years. I didn't have a Filipino passport, Filipino citizenship. I was a guest. I had paperwork that just allowed me to be there. And so how I view myself in relationship to my context, well, I don't go about trying to make a mess of things. If I'm going to be a guest, I'm going to be a good one. I'm going to try to conduct myself carefully obeying the laws, carefully doing everything I'm supposed to do. I mean, it's critical that I do, right? But at the same time, I also recognize that in a certain sense, it's not my home. I'm not going to deeply invest in it as like my future. I'm a guest. Okay, the concept of this strangers and exiles, you and I are guests in the world that we inhabit. I live here. I have to interact here. And so I'm going to work through culture and I'm going to try to fit. I'm going to learn the language. If I'm in the Philippines, I'm going to wear the barong. I'm going to do the things that I ought to do. I'm going to appreciate their food. I'm going to be kind. But I'm also not just going to absorb everything about my culture, American, Canadian, or Filipino, because there's brokenness in all of it. And that will continue when we later talk in our next lecture about contextualization, the challenge of sorting through ethics in different contexts. How ought a Christian to live in every context of the world? But the starting point for us in this lecture then is simply openly, humbly acknowledge that in each of our contexts, I need to work at learning. I need to humbly work together with the people around me. I need to turn to them and ask for their input and grow. I need to be a student of my context. I need to recognize the rich diversity and complexity of my context. And then ultimately, I need to do the hard work of this, living as a stranger and a pilgrim, as strangers and pilgrims abstaining from the brokenness of my surrounding culture, while I seek to faithfully honor and serve my God. Missions then calls us to the most difficult of tasks. We have to adapt, we have to learn, we have to humbly grow, and then we have to sort out culture from its good and its negative forms, living soberly, righteously, and godly in the world and in the place where God has called us to his honor.